What if the real story of Eve didn't end in a garden, but continued in Alexandria? What if Cleopatra wasn't the downfall of great men, but the last symbol of sacred feminine power rewritten by those who feared her mind more than her body? For 2,000 years, the church, the state, and the stage have told one story, a woman of beauty, of vanity, of ruin. But a deeper hidden thread, lost to time, dismissed by scholars, whispers of a queen who knew too much. A queen whose fall wasn't just political, it was theological. And now, we're going to trace that thread, back to its source. You don't want to miss what's behind this veil, because what we're about to uncover, it doesn't just challenge history, it rewrites it. It starts, not with a war or a coronation, but with a whisper in the dark. A figure, cloaked in gold and smoke, walks through the marble halls of a dying empire. Her eyes do not belong to the Cleopatra Hollywood showed you. They do not seduce. They calculate, measure, command. Her lips do not speak in riddles. They speak languages: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Parthian, Latin, and maybe, just maybe, truth. Now pause again. Ask yourself this. What happens when a woman dares to think like a ruler, and the world cannot bear the thought? What story does the world tell then? Because every age has its witches, its sirens, its Eves. And when a woman stands too close to power, the men who write history don't always burn her body. They burn her name. You think you know Cleopatra. You've seen her in silver screen spectacles, wrapped in silk, lounging in luxury, playing puppet master to Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She was the woman who brought Rome to its knees, right? But what if that entire image was a weapon, a narrative designed not to remember her, but to erase her? What if she wasn't a seductress, but a naval commander, a medical scholar, a theologian, and a queen who walked the line between empire and apocalypse? In this story, we won't just look at Cleopatra the queen. We'll look at Cleopatra as the final echo of a divine archetype, the feminine wisdom that empires always try to silence. The woman who, like Eve, reached for the knowledge forbidden and paid the price. But to find her, to see her for who she really was, we have to walk through a door, not just any door, a door carved by empire, sealed by myth, and locked from the inside. It has no handle. It opens only if you're willing to question everything. So, are you? Let's step into the space between two worlds. On one side, Rome, ruthless, rising, devouring. On the other, Egypt, ancient, wise, quietly unraveling. And in between them stands her, not just a queen, not just a woman, but a bridge between empires, cultures, gods, and centuries. But here's the problem. History hates bridges. It prefers borders, divisions, zandas, enemies, conquerors, and conquered. So what does it do with someone like Cleopatra? Simple. It turns her into a myth that serves the victors. It paints her not as the last pharaoh of an ancient divine order, but as the beautiful distraction that led mighty men to ruin. It sexualizes what it couldn't understand. It trivializes what it feared. Let's get something straight. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian by blood. She was Greek, Macedonian, a descendant of Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's most ambitious generals. Her family ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. And not one of them, not one, bothered to learn the language of the people they ruled. Until her, yes. Cleopatra VII. Philopator was the first in her line to speak Egyptian fluently. Think about that. Born into a foreign dynasty surrounded by palace intrigue, corruption, incestuous power plays, she made a choice. To learn the language of the land, to honor the gods of the Nile, to speak directly to the people, without a translator. This wasn't just optics. This was strategy. This was reverence. This was theology. Because Egypt didn't just have politics, it had divine order, To be pharaoh wasn't just to rule, it was to embody Mayat, the principle of harmony, justice, cosmic balance. And Cleopatra? She didn't just claim the throne, she inhabited it. She presented herself as the living image of Isis, goddess of magic, healing, and queenship. So, tell me, how do you go from living goddess to exotic temptress? Rome. That's how. Rome understood something fundamental. If you can't erase a woman's power, you distort it. After her death, they couldn't burn her kingdom again, so they burned her reputation. They painted her as decadent, dangerous, seductive. A woman who led not one but two great men astray, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But here's what they don't tell you in textbooks or epics. She didn't chase power through romance, she negotiated survival through alliance. Let's break that down. When Cleopatra met Caesar, she was 21. Rome had already propped up her rival brother on the throne. She had been exiled, hunted. Her re-entry into Alexandria wasn't a flirtation, it was a coup. Wrapped in a rug, smuggled into Caesar's private quarters, she didn't bat her lashes. She made her case. Egypt was on the brink. Rome needed grain. She needed an army. He needed legitimacy. They didn't fall in love. They struck a deal. When Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra returned to Egypt pregnant, with a future. But the wolves were circling. Rome was splitting at the seams, and so was she. Then came Antony. To the Romans, their affair was proof of her decadence. Their children, proof of her corruption. But to the East? To her people? She was the mother of kings, queen of a united Nile and Levant, a strategist who leveraged Rome's fragmentation to secure peace for as long as she could hold it. But it wasn't just military. Cleopatra was a scholar, a philosopher, a writer. She studied at what was left of the Library of Alexandria. She penned treatises on cosmetics, alchemy, gynecology. She understood medicine, navigation, astronomy. This was a woman trained in statecraft, science, and symbology, more than most Roman senators ever dreamed of. But history didn't remember her pen. It remembered her perfume. Why? Because knowledge in the hands of a woman, especially one not born Roman, was a threat too great to be remembered. So here she stands, between two empires. Rome rising like a furnace, Egypt fading like a hymn. She is neither one nor the other. She is the line, and Rome's only way forward is to erase that line completely. And that is exactly what they tried to do. But if the woman they erased still echoes, what happens when we start listening again? What if we've been looking at Cleopatra all wrong? What if the real reason she terrified Rome wasn't in her smile, her walk, her scent, but in her mind? She wasn't just queen of a nation. She was queen of knowledge, long before Silicon Valley made data sexy, long before Oxford defined prestige. There was the Library of Alexandria, and Cleopatra ruled over its dying embers. It wasn't what it once was. The fires of war had taken their toll, but it still breathed, and so did she. Cleopatra was educated in the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, the world's most ambitious intellectual project. Think of it like an ancient NASA, Google, and Harvard, rolled into one, with priests and scholars instead of tech bros and tweed jackets. Here, Cleopatra studied everything: astronomy, mathematics, rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, linguistics, alchemy. She wasn't just fluent in Greek and Egyptian. She spoke 9 languages, possibly more. She could debate with rabbis in Hebrew, negotiate with Parthians in their native tongue, and interpret sacred Egyptian rites without a single translator. That's not beauty, that's power. Here's a fact that never makes it into the movies. Cleopatra was an author. We don't have her original manuscripts. They've been lost to time, conquest, and maybe even deliberate destruction. But ancient writers confirm she wrote medical treatises. One text was allegedly on cosmetics and pharmacology, not lipstick and blush, but formulas for healing balms, wound care, and even contraceptives. She was writing at a time when female bodies were studied only as tools for reproduction or control, and she dared to publish knowledge about them. For them. How many empires can a woman threaten just by explaining how her body works? The answer, apparently, is at least one. Now, picture this. The Roman Senate. Old men in togas, bickering over how much grain to steal from Egypt this month. Meanwhile, across the sea, Cleopatra is stabilizing a collapsed economy, introducing new tax laws to help farmers, funding public works, translating sacred texts, writing on women's health, commanding fleets, and raising heirs, all while preparing for a Roman civil war that she knows will come to her doorstep. She was a polymath in a world that expected women to be property. That's not dangerous. To a patriarchal republic built on conquest and inheritance, that's terrifying. Think of the timelines. Caesar dies in 44 BCE. Cleopatra lives on. Antony takes power, Rome fractures. Cleopatra rises. Every time Rome stumbles, she strengthens Egypt's position. She waits. She watches. She chooses alliances not out of lust, but out of timing. Every seduction was a strategy. Every whisper was a calculation. Every child was a legacy forged in war. And all of it was documented. By her. In records we no longer possess. What knowledge did we lose when we lost Cleopatra's voice? What stories were never told because they were never allowed to survive? The truth is this. Powerful women rarely get to write their own stories. Their pens are stolen, their scrolls burned, their voices overwritten. We don't know what Cleopatra really said, but we know what was said about her. And that silence, it's louder than any battle. So, when Rome tells you Cleopatra was a seductress, ask yourself, is that what she was? Or is that what they needed her to be? Because if a queen can outthink generals, outmaneuver senators, and outlast emperors, maybe the myth wasn't created to reveal her. Maybe it was created to bury her. And next, we'll uncover exactly who picked up the shovel. History is written by the victors. A tired phrase. Until you realize it's not just true, it's lethal. Because the greatest assassination in Roman history wasn't Caesar, it was Cleopatra's reputation. To understand why Cleopatra had to be destroyed, you have to understand this. She wasn't just a woman. She was an idea. And ideas are dangerous, especially when they come wrapped in silk, seated on a throne, fluent in 9 languages, and commanding a fleet on the Nile. She represented everything Rome feared. The East, the feminine, the intellectual, the ancient, and most of all, a rival version of civilization. Let's dismantle the love triangle. Everyone knows the story, right? Cleopatra seduces Julius Caesar. Later, she falls for Mark Antony. They have an epic, doomed romance. Rome wins. She dies. Tragedy complete. It's Shakespearean, and also strategically misleading. Because the truth? Cleopatra didn't fall in love. She aligned. Her relationships were moves on a chessboard soaked in blood. She needed Caesar to keep her throne. She needed Antony to keep her nation, and they needed her too. Egypt was rich. Egypt had grain. Egypt had ships. Egypt had the only female monarch in the Mediterranean who could think, lead, and rule on her own. To Rome, Cleopatra was never just a consort. She was a sovereign, and sovereigns can't be tolerated. By 32 BCE, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and political heir, saw his moment. Mark Antony was off in the east, consolidating power alongside Cleopatra. Their children were given royal titles. They spoke of a new empire, centered in Alexandria. Let that sink in, not Rome. Alexandria. That's not a romance. That's a revolution. So Octavian went to war. But not with Antony alone. He declared war on Cleopatra, a foreign queen, a woman, a scholar, a ruler. He called it a war to save Rome from her influence. He wasn't just attacking her armies, he was attacking her image. Octavian launched the first state-sponsored smear campaign in history. He told Rome that Cleopatra was a manipulative witch, a corrupter of men, an exotic seductress who had enslaved Antony, a threat to Roman values, not just a queen, but a demon. He sent pamphlets. He staged public readings. He minted coins showing Cleopatra as a serpent, a symbol of danger. She was no longer a scholar, no longer a ruler. She became a cautionary tale. And Antony? He wasn't a general anymore. He was her victim. A man unmanned by love. A Roman turned traitor. A war hero now bewitched. This wasn't gossip. This was policy. The narrative had to be simple for the people. She's the snake. We are the sword. Rome must strike before it is swallowed whole. And the Roman people bought it. Because propaganda, when wrapped in patriotism and fear, becomes something far more powerful than truth. It becomes reality. The Battle of Actium wasn't just a naval clash, it was the final blow to a story Cleopatra never got to finish telling. Her fleet lost, her lover dead, her empire dying, and with her final act, suicide by mythic snakebite or smuggled poison, her enemies got the ending they wanted. Or so they thought. When Octavian returned to Rome, he wasn't just a victor. He was a savior. He had destroyed the evil queen who threatened to steal Rome's soul. He wasn't just defending a nation. He was restoring order. And with that, he became the first emperor, Augustus, the man who killed the Republic and birthed the empire, on the grave of a woman he never even met. Think about that. He didn't just destroy her armies, he destroyed her memory. And then, like a true master of narrative, he rewrote the rest. And that's why, 2,000 years later, you know Cleopatra as the seductress. Not the scholar, not the strategist, not the sovereign. Because her story didn't survive. Her enemies did. What if Cleopatra's downfall wasn't because she was too seductive, but because she was too powerful? We've been asking the wrong question all along. The real mystery of Cleopatra isn't whether she was a seductress or a sovereign. It's this. Why did Rome need you to believe she was the former and forget she was the latter? Because that question changes everything. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But you don't just seize total power, you justify it. And to do that, he needed a villain so vile, so foreign, so corrupting, that his rise would feel righteous. Enter Cleopatra, rebranded. She wasn't dead, she was immortalized, as Rome's ultimate cautionary tale, the foreign woman who seduced and destroyed noble Romans, the Eastern queen who dared to rival the West, the dangerous other who had to be purged for civilization to survive. In Augustus's version, Antony wasn't defeated by politics or war. He was emasculated by lust. And Cleopatra? She was never a queen, just a manipulator, a temptress, a threat. It's not history. It's a character assassination campaign. And it worked. This myth survived for over 2,000 years. Shakespeare picked it up. Hollywood embraced it. Pop culture embedded it. Elizabeth Taylor, Monica Bellucci, even Katy Perry, all cast in the same mold, exotic, alluring, deadly, but almost never brilliant. Never the woman who wrote medical treatises, ran a complex economy, commanded fleets, defended an ancient civilization with fire and steel, because brilliance is harder to sexualize. The real revelation? Cleopatra wasn't the target. She was the tool, a narrative weapon, a proxy for fears that still echo today. Fear of the powerful woman, fear of the foreign mind, fear of the East rising as the West clings to order. Cleopatra was erased from history's altar so that Rome's sins could be sanctified. So when you hear her called the last pharaoh, don't picture a woman reclining in silk. Picture a queen, fighting a war she couldn't win, outwitted by spin, and buried beneath 2,000 years of narrative fog. Not because she was weak, but because she was too strong to be left standing. So, what does all this mean for us? Why does an ancient queen's manipulated image matter today? That's where we go next, where Cleopatra's story reveals the stories we're still telling and believing. If you thought this was just about Cleopatra, think again. This is about the stories we're still trapped inside, stories about power, stories about gender, stories about truth and who gets to write it. We like to think we've evolved, but look closer. When a powerful woman steps into the spotlight today, do we call her strategic or manipulative? When she makes an alliance, is it diplomacy or seduction? When she leads with confidence, is she decisive or too ambitious? Cleopatra's image wasn't just rewritten, it was replicated again and again. From history books to media headlines to office boardrooms. Let's be clear. This isn't just about a queen lost to time, it's about what happens when the wrong story wins. When power fears truth, it turns to narrative. And narrative, when weaponized, becomes more dangerous than swords or ships. Octavian won the war, yes, but he also won the edit. He taught us something that dictators, media barons, and spin doctors never forgot. If you control the story, you control the legacy. And if you control the legacy, you control the future. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Cleopatra is still fighting. Not for Egypt, not for Antony, but for her story. For the right to be remembered not as a caricature, but as a complex, powerful, intelligent leader. And when we let her real story surface, we're not just correcting the past, we're liberating the present. So now, the mirror turns to us. What narratives are we living inside that someone else wrote? Whose voices are we dismissing because they don't fit the familiar script? What if, like Cleopatra, you're more than the role you've been given? This isn't about idolizing the past, it's about reclaiming it, to understand who we are right now. So here we are. We began with a myth. A femme fatale draped in silk, seducing empires into ruin. But we end with something far more dangerous, far more inspiring. A woman who used not just her beauty, but her mind, her tongue, her culture, her craft, to lead a nation through one of the most volatile moments in human history. A queen, a scholar, a strategist, a survivor. We've peeled back 2,000 years of propaganda. We've watched how Octavian, hungry to build an empire, needed a villain more than a rival. So he didn't just defeat Cleopatra on the battlefield, he executed her in memory, rewriting her into a dangerous foreign temptress so that Rome's civil war would look like a holy crusade. And, for centuries, we believed him. Because that's what history often is. Not a record of what happened, but a record of who won. But here's the twist no one saw coming. We weren't just victims of this narrative. We became its amplifiers. Every time we told her story as a seductress, every time we cast Elizabeth Taylor in Violet Eyes, every time we whispered, "She brought down great men," we reinforced the lie. But now you know better. And when you know better, you can tell better. Cleopatra's true story doesn't belong to Egypt. It doesn't belong to Rome. Not to Hollywood. Not even to historians. It belongs to anyone who's ever been misunderstood on purpose. To anyone who's had their strength called dangerous. To anyone who's had to fight for the right to be the author of their own story. And that means it belongs to you. So now I'll ask you, what part of Cleopatra's true legacy surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. Seriously, I want to hear your thoughts. And if this video changed the way you see her, or history, give it a like. Hit subscribe if you're ready for more deep dives that don't just retell history, they rewrite the narrative. And one last thing, you've just uncovered a 2,000-year-old lie. Imagine what else is still buried beneath the myths we were raised on. This is just the beginning.